Every legal encounter leaves a trace. Every strict investigation pursues honesty. Comprehending your legal rights, establishing true justice.
I said don't move! Immigration enforcement, show me your papers or you're being detained!
My hands are right here. I'm a United States citizen. I'm also a police officer with Charlotte Mecklenburg.
I said don't move, sir!
Here's my badge in my back pocket. I'm not reaching until you tell me it's okay, but you're making a mistake.
I'm a Charlotte Mecklenburg officer. Taser, now! Wait! Taser discharge him. I'm not just tase the cop.
Agent Derek Brennan's record showed 47 immigration stops in minority neighborhoods in just 3 months, a number that should have raised red flags, but instead earned him praise from his supervisor. And when he rolled up on a black man standing outside his own car in a Target parking lot, Brennan saw another easy statistic to add to his quota. "Don't move, immigration enforcement. Show me your papers, or you're being detained for failure to comply," Brennan shouted as he exited his vehicle, his hand already reaching for his cuffs, while his partner, Agent Rodriguez, blocked the man's car door. What they didn't know was that the man they were about to slam against the hood of his own vehicle, the man whose rights they were about to violate in broad daylight, was Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, a decorated police supervisor who had never lost a case in court. And this $13.9 million lawsuit was about to be his biggest win yet. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from. And make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Marcus Hayes was 42 years old, and March 15, 2019 was supposed to be his first real day off in 3 weeks. He had spent the morning sleeping in, something his wife Angela had been begging him to do for months, and by early afternoon he decided to make a Target run to pick up birthday supplies for his daughter's 10th birthday party that weekend. Marcus stood 6'2", with an athletic build that came from twice-weekly basketball games at the police gym and a strict routine his training officer had drilled into him 15 years ago. He wore a gray Charlotte Hornets hoodie, dark jeans, and white sneakers, the kind of comfortable civilian clothes that felt foreign after spending most of his life in uniform. His unmarked police vehicle sat in his driveway at home because he had taken Angela's Honda Accord, wanting to feel like a regular person for once, instead of Lieutenant Hayes of the Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department's East District. The Target parking lot was moderately busy for a Thursday afternoon, with families loading groceries and teenagers hanging around the Starbucks entrance. Marcus had just loaded 2 bags into the trunk, one filled with birthday decorations and another with the specific brand of chips his daughter had requested, when he noticed the white SUV with government plates pulling into the lane behind him. He didn't think much of it at first, because off-duty cops develop a habit of noticing vehicles and patterns without always reacting to them. But when the SUV stopped at an angle that blocked his car from backing out, and 2 men in tactical vests marked ICE stepped out with purpose in their stride, Marcus felt his stomach tighten with a familiar feeling he had seen on too many faces during his career, but had never experienced himself. The driver was Agent Derek Brennan, a white man in his mid-30s with a buzz cut, and the kind of aggressive posture that Marcus recognized from officers who had something to prove. Brennan had joined ICE 4 years earlier after washing out of the DEA for what his file called excessive use of force during routine operations, a polite way of saying he had hospitalized 2 suspects during traffic stops that never should have turned physical. His supervisor in Charlotte had noted Brennan's enthusiasm and dedication to enforcement, but community complaints told a different story about an agent who saw every brown face as a potential deportation and every question as a challenge to his authority. In the previous 3 months alone, Brennan had stopped 47 people in predominantly black and Latino neighborhoods, demanding papers and identification from citizens whose only crime was existing in public spaces while not being white. Brennan approached Marcus with his hand resting on his belt near his cuffs, and his partner, Agent Carlos Rodriguez, circled around to position himself near the driver's side door of the Honda. Rodriguez was younger, maybe late 20s, and Marcus could see the uncertainty in his body language even as he followed Brennan's lead. "Immigration and Customs Enforcement," Brennan announced loudly enough that several shoppers turned to look. "I need to see your identification and proof of citizenship right now." Marcus kept his hands visible on the trunk lid, an instinct born from 15 years of training other officers on de-escalation and survival. "I'm a United States citizen," he said calmly, his voice steady despite the anger already building in his chest. "I'm also a police officer with Charlotte Mecklenburg. My identification is in my wallet in my front right pocket." Brennan's eyes narrowed with immediate suspicion rather than recognition. "Sure you are," he said with a smirk that Marcus had seen on the faces of defendants who thought they were smarter than the system. "Everyone's a cop when they get stopped. Keep your hands where I can see them, and don't reach for anything." Marcus felt the situation shifting into a dangerous territory, the kind of moment he had lectured about in countless training sessions about implicit bias and constitutional rights. "I'm going to slowly reach for my wallet to show you my credentials," Marcus said, his hands moving in deliberate slow motion toward his pocket. "I have a badge and department-issued identification." "I said don't move," Brennan snapped, stepping closer with his hand now on his weapon. "Rodriguez, secure him while I check the vehicle." Agent Rodriguez hesitated for a fraction of a second, and Marcus saw the younger agent glance at Brennan with something that looked like doubt. But training and hierarchy won out over common sense, and Rodriguez moved behind Marcus while pulling out his handcuffs. "Sir, I need you to put your hands behind your back," Rodriguez said quietly, almost apologetically. Marcus turned his head slightly to look at Rodriguez, keeping his movements slow and controlled. "I'm Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, badge number 4127, East District Supervisor," he said clearly. "You are making a serious mistake right now." Brennan laughed, actually laughed, as he began looking through the Honda's windows. "Lieutenant Marcus Hayes," he repeated mockingly, "and I'm the director of the FBI. You got any warrants we should know about? Any reason you're so nervous about showing ID?" A small crowd had begun to gather at a safe distance, and Marcus could see at least 3 people with their phones out recording the encounter. An elderly white woman with a target bag watched with her hand over her mouth, and a black teenager stood near the store entrance with his camera aimed directly at Brennan. Marcus knew this moment was being documented, knew that everything he said and did would be reviewed and analyzed, and he made a conscious decision to stay calm even as Rodriguez's hands touched his wrists to apply the handcuffs. "I'm not resisting," Marcus said loud enough for the cameras to hear. "I'm complying under protest. I've identified myself as a law enforcement officer, and you are violating my Fourth Amendment rights." Brennan turned from the car with an expression of theatrical annoyance. "Fourth Amendment," he repeated. "You've been watching too much TV. This is a routine immigration compliance check, which we have full authority to conduct." He walked back to Marcus and stood close enough that Marcus could smell coffee on his breath. "Now, are you going to cooperate and show me proof of citizenship? Or are we going to do this the hard way?" Marcus met Brennan's eyes with the kind of steady gaze he had perfected in interrogation rooms and courtrooms. "My wallet is in my front right pocket," he said evenly. "My police credentials are inside. You can verify my identity with one phone call to Charlotte Mecklenburg Dispatch." Brennan reached into Marcus's pocket himself, pulling out a leather wallet that Marcus had received as a gift from his wife on their 10th anniversary. He flipped it open and stared at the gold lieutenant's badge and the department identification card with Marcus's photo, name, and rank clearly visible. For a moment, something flickered across Brennan's face. Uncertainty or maybe recognition that he had made a terrible error. but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Could be fake," Brennan said, though his voice had lost some of its aggressive edge. "Rodriguez, call it in. Let's see if this checks out." Marcus felt the handcuffs click around his wrists, not tight enough to hurt, but secure enough to restrict his movement. And he stood in the Target parking lot on his day off, a decorated police lieutenant being detained like a criminal while shoppers recorded and whispered and tried to understand what they were witnessing. The birthday decorations sat in his trunk, forgotten. His daughter's party was 2 days away, and Agent Derek Brennan had just made the biggest mistake of his career, though he didn't know it yet. The afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt, and Marcus took slow, measured breaths, already thinking about documentation and witnesses and the case he was about to build. Because if this could happen to him, a lieutenant with a badge and 15 years of service, what was happening to people who didn't have his resources or his knowledge of the system? That thought, more than the handcuffs or the humiliation, made Marcus decide that this wasn't going to end with an apology or a quiet settlement. This was going to end in a courtroom. The call to Charlotte Mecklenburg Dispatch should have taken 2 minutes, but Agent Rodriguez stood 15 feet away with his phone pressed to his ear for almost 10 minutes, while Marcus remained in handcuffs next to his wife's Honda. The crowd in the Target parking lot had grown from a handful of curious shoppers to nearly 30 people, most of them recording on their phones, and Marcus could hear fragments of their conversations drifting across the asphalt. "That's messed up," a young black woman said to her friend. "They just grabbed him for no reason." An older white man shook his head and muttered something about "just comply," but even he kept his phone out filming. Marcus stood perfectly still with his hands cuffed behind his back, his shoulders starting to ache from the position, and he watched Brennan pace near the SUV with increasing agitation, while Rodriguez's conversation stretched longer than any routine verification should take. Rodriguez finally walked back with his phone still in his hand, and his face carrying an expression that Marcus recognized from rookie officers who had just realized they were in over their heads. "Dispatch confirms a Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, badge 4127, assigned to East District," Rodriguez said quietly to Brennan. And even from 6 feet away, Marcus could see Brennan's jaw tighten. "They're asking why we have him detained, and if we need supervisory assistance." Brennan snatched the phone from Rodriguez's hand and turned away from Marcus to speak in a lower voice. But Marcus had 15 years of experience reading body language, and the conversation was clearly not going well. Brennan's free hand kept gesturing sharply, his shoulders hunched forward in defensive posture, and when he finally ended the call, his face had gone red with barely controlled anger. He walked back to Marcus, but instead of uncuffing him immediately, Brennan crossed his arms and stared like he was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. "So you really are a cop," Brennan said, and there was no apology in his voice, just resentment mixed with something that sounded like accusation. "What were you doing out here in street clothes acting suspicious?" Marcus felt a flash of genuine anger break through his professional calm. "Acting suspicious," he repeated slowly. "I was loading birthday supplies into my car on my day off. What exactly about that was suspicious?" "Don't get smart with me," Brennan snapped. "You match the description of someone we've been looking for in this area." It was such an obvious lie that even Rodriguez looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot and refusing to make eye contact with anyone. A woman's voice cut through the tension from the crowd. "That's bullshit, and everyone here knows it," shouted the young black woman who had been recording since the beginning. "You stopped him because he's black. We all saw it." Several other voices murmured agreement, and Marcus saw Brennan's hand drift toward his radio. "Ma'am, step back or you'll be detained for interfering with a federal investigation," Brennan called out, his voice taking on an edge of desperation masked as authority. The woman didn't step back, and neither did anyone else in the crowd. If anything, more people moved closer, their phones held high to capture every moment. Marcus made a calculated decision. "Agent Brennan," he said firmly, "you need to remove these handcuffs right now. You've verified my identity. You have no legal basis to continue detaining me. Every second you keep me in restraints is another count of false imprisonment and civil rights violation." Brennan's face went from red to almost purple. "Are you threatening me?" he demanded, stepping so close that Marcus could feel the heat coming off him. "You think because you're some local cop that you can tell a federal agent how to do his job?" "I'm telling you the law," Marcus replied, keeping his voice level despite wanting to shout. "The same law you're supposed to be upholding. Now uncuff me or call your supervisor, because this situation is being documented by 30 witnesses, and you're making it worse with every second." For a moment, Marcus thought Brennan might actually escalate further, might shove him or try to force him into the ICE vehicle, but Rodriguez cleared his throat and spoke up for the first time with something like backbone. "Brennan, maybe we should just cut him loose," Rodriguez said carefully. "Dispatch confirmed everything, and we've got a lot of people watching." Brennan whirled on his partner. "I decide when we're done here, not dispatch and not him," he said, pointing at Marcus. "I want to search his vehicle. Something doesn't add up." Marcus felt his professional restraint starting to crack. "You want to search my vehicle?" he said, no longer bothering to hide the anger in his voice. "On what probable cause? What crime do you suspect me of committing? Being black in a Target parking lot?" "Suspected immigration violation," Brennan shot back. "That gives me authority to search for evidence of illegal status or harboring." "I'm a United States citizen," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "Born in Charlotte. You've confirmed my identity as a police lieutenant. You have zero probable cause, and you know it." Brennan pulled out his own cuffs and took a step toward Marcus. "I have probable cause to believe you're being uncooperative and potentially dangerous," he said. "Rodriguez, help me get him secured in our vehicle while I complete my investigation." That was the moment Marcus knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't going to end with reason or de-escalation, because Brennan had committed too far to back down without losing face, and men like him would rather destroy their careers than admit they were wrong. Marcus planted his feet and spoke clearly for the cameras. "I do not consent to any search. I do not consent to being moved to your vehicle. I am not resisting, but I am asserting my constitutional rights as a United States citizen and as a law enforcement officer." Brennan grabbed Marcus's arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. "You're resisting right now," Brennan said, and Marcus recognized the setup, the narrative being constructed in real time. "Rodriguez, assist me in securing the suspect." Rodriguez hesitated again, looking between Brennan and Marcus and the crowd of witnesses, and Marcus saw the exact moment the younger agent made his choice and moved forward to grab Marcus's other arm. They pulled him away from his car, and Marcus kept his body loose and non-resistant while stating clearly, "I am not resisting. I am being moved against my will without cause." The crowd erupted. "Let him go!" someone shouted. "This is police brutality," another voice called out, apparently not catching the irony that Marcus was the police. The elderly white woman who had been watching finally found her voice. "Young man, he showed you his badge," she said to Brennan with surprising strength. "What more do you want?" Brennan ignored everyone and forced Marcus toward the ICE vehicle, and that's when Marcus saw the police cruiser pulling into the parking lot. It was a marked Charlotte Mecklenburg unit, black and white with the department seal on the door, and Marcus felt a strange mixture of relief and humiliation, knowing that his own colleagues were about to witness him in handcuffs, being detained by federal agents. The cruiser's lights weren't on, but it moved with purpose through the parking lot, navigating around the crowd until it stopped about 20 feet from the ICE vehicle. 2 officers stepped out, and Marcus recognized them immediately. Officer Jennifer Chen was a 7-year veteran who had worked under Marcus when she was a rookie, and Officer David Thompson was newer to East District, but Marcus had approved his transfer paperwork just last month. Both of them froze when they saw Marcus in handcuffs between 2 ICE agents. Chen recovered first and walked forward, with her hand resting on her duty belt. Not on her weapon, but in a ready position. "Lieutenant Hayes?" she said, her voice carrying clear confusion and concern. "Sir, what's going on here?" Brennan actually looked relieved to see other law enforcement, like he thought they would support his position. "Officers, this man was acting suspiciously and failed to provide adequate proof of citizenship during a routine compliance check," he said with renewed confidence. "We're conducting a federal investigation." Chen's eyes went cold in a way Marcus had seen when she dealt with domestic abusers and child predators. "That man is Lieutenant Marcus Hayes," she said slowly, like she was explaining something to a child. "He's my supervisor. He's been with Charlotte Mecklenburg for 15 years. Thompson had his phone out now, and Marcus realized he was either recording or calling someone. "Lieutenant Hayes has 3 commendations for valor and 2 for community service," Thompson added, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "He teaches constitutional law at the academy. So what exactly made him look suspicious?" Brennan's confidence wavered, but he pushed forward. "That's irrelevant. We have authority to conduct immigration enforcement regardless of local law enforcement status." "On a United States citizen?" Chen shot back. "On a police lieutenant? You're telling me you saw a black man loading groceries and decided that was suspicious enough to detain him?" The parking lot had gone almost silent, except for the sound of phone cameras recording and the distant beep of a car alarm. Marcus stood between Brennan and Rodriguez, still in handcuffs, and watched his colleagues build the case he would need in court. Every word, every witness, every second of illegal detention was being documented. Dictator Thompson put his phone away and looked directly at Brennan. "I just spoke with Captain Morrison," he said. "He's on his way with a supervisor. He also said to tell you that Lieutenant Hayes is represented by the Fraternal Order of Police legal team, and you should probably think very carefully about your next move." Brennan finally seemed to understand that the situation had spiraled completely out of his control. His hand shook slightly as he reached for his cuff key, and when he removed the restraints from Marcus's wrists, he did it roughly, without apology or acknowledgement. Marcus's hands were free, but his wrists showed red marks where the metal had pressed into his skin, and he rubbed them slowly while staring at Brennan with an expression that promised this was far from over. "You're free to go," Brennan muttered, already backing toward his vehicle. Routine check cleared. Marcus didn't move. "I want your names, badge numbers, and supervisor's contact information," he said clearly. "And I want the incident report number for this detention." "There's no incident," Brennan said quickly. "Just a misunderstanding." "Sticked." "There are 30 witnesses and multiple video recordings that say otherwise," Marcus replied. "Now give me your information, or I'll file a formal complaint with Homeland Security Investigations and the Office of Inspector General tonight." Rodriguez stepped forward and pulled out his card, handing it to Marcus with something that might have been an apology in his eyes. Brennan stood by his vehicle looking like he wanted to disappear, and when Chen walked over and stood next to Marcus with her arms crossed and her expression cold, Brennan finally got in his SUV and drove away without another word. Marcus stood in the Target parking lot, holding Rodriguez's business card, surrounded by his colleagues and witnesses and phone cameras, and he felt the full weight of what had just happened settling onto his shoulders. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every person who didn't have a badge, who didn't have colleagues to call, who didn't have the resources to fight back. And Marcus Hayes, who had never lost a case in court, was about to make sure Derek Brennan never forgot the day he decided a black man loading birthday supplies was suspicious enough to detain. Captain Robert Morrison arrived in the Target parking lot 23 minutes after Thompson's call, and Marcus could tell from the speed of his approach that someone had already briefed him on the situation. Morrison was a 28-year veteran with silver hair and a reputation for protecting his officers like they were family, and when he saw the red marks on Marcus's wrists and the crowd of witnesses still lingering with their phones out, his face went through several distinct stages of anger before settling into the cold professionalism that meant someone was about to face consequences. He walked straight to Marcus, ignoring Chen and Thompson, and looked him over like a father checking his son for injuries after a fight. "Are you hurt?" Morrison asked quietly, and Marcus shook his head even though his shoulders ached, and his wrists throbbed and his pride felt like it had been dragged through broken glass. Morrison nodded once and then turned to survey the parking lot, taking in the witnesses and the lingering atmosphere of tension. "Where are the ICE agents?" "They left about 5 minutes ago," Chen said, stepping forward with her phone. "But I got their vehicle number, and Agent Rodriguez gave Lieutenant Hayes his card. The primary agent was Derek Brennan. I recorded the last part of the confrontation, and at least a dozen civilians have full videos from the beginning." Morrison pulled out his phone and made a call that lasted less than 30 seconds, speaking in clipped sentences that Marcus recognized as the captain going directly to the chief. When he hung up, Morrison looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed sympathy with the kind of rage that comes from watching injustice happen to someone you respect. "Chief wants you to come to headquarters," Morrison said. "We're filing formal complaints with Homeland Security Investigations, the ICE Office of Professional Responsibility, and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Tonight?" Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a transition from shock and humiliation into the focused determination he usually reserved for major cases. "I want every witness statement," he said, his voice steady now that he had a clear path forward. "I want copies of all the video footage, and I want the body camera recordings from Chen and Thompson." "Already done," Thompson said, holding up his phone. "I've been in contact with 6 witnesses who are willing to give formal statements. The woman in the red jacket over there is a retired paralegal, and she's organizing the others." Morrison put his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Marcus, I need you to hear me on this," he said seriously. "What happened to you today is unacceptable. It's illegal, and we're going to make sure everyone involved faces consequences. But I also need you to understand that this is going to get ugly. ICE is federal. They have resources and protection. This fight is going to take time and energy, and it's going to put you in the spotlight in ways that might be uncomfortable." Marcus looked at the crowd of witnesses, at the young black woman who had shouted down Brennan, at the elderly white woman who had defended him, at Chen and Thompson who had arrived like cavalry to support their lieutenant. He thought about his daughter's birthday party in 2 days, about trying to explain to a 10-year-old why her father had been handcuffed in public, about all the people who experienced this kind of treatment, without badges or cameras, or captains willing to go to war for them. "I'm not backing down," Marcus said firmly. "If this happened to me, imagine what's happening to people without resources. We're taking this all the way." Morrison smiled, the kind of smile that appeared before he demolished a defense attorney in court. "Good," he said, "because the chief already called the FOP legal team, and they're salivating over this case. Apparently, civil rights violations against law enforcement officers are their specialty." The drive to police headquarters took 15 minutes, and Marcus spent the entire trip on the phone with Angela, explaining what had happened before she saw it on the news. Her initial concern shifted quickly to fury, and by the time Marcus finished describing Brennan's behavior, she was already talking about lawyers and lawsuits and making sure everyone involved lost their jobs. Marcus loved her for it, for the immediate shift into protective mode. But he also heard the fear underneath her anger, because they both knew that, badge or no badge, there were people in this country who saw his skin color before they saw anything else. Police headquarters was buzzing with activity when Marcus arrived, and he realized that Morrison had called in favors and assembled a team before Marcus even walked through the door. The conference room on the third floor held Assistant Chief Patricia Williams, 2 attorneys from the FOP legal team, a representative from the North Carolina ACLU who had apparently heard about the incident within an hour, and Detective Sarah Kim from Internal Affairs who specialized in documenting use of force incidents. They all stood when Marcus entered, and the expressions on their faces ranged from anger to determination to something that looked like vindication, as if they had been waiting for a case exactly like this. Attorney Michael Chen, no relation to Officer Jennifer Chen, was a sharp-dressed man in his 50s who had built a career on police misconduct cases and civil rights violations. He shook Marcus's hand with a grip that communicated solidarity and introduced himself before diving straight into business. "Lieutenant Hayes, I've reviewed the preliminary information Captain Morrison sent over," Chen said, gesturing to a laptop displaying freeze frames from witness videos. "What happened to you today represents multiple clear violations of your Fourth Amendment rights, Fifth Amendment due process, and 14th Amendment equal protection. We're looking at false imprisonment, unlawful detention, assault, battery, and deprivation of civil rights under color of federal authority." The second attorney, Lisa Rodriguez, was younger, but had a reputation for aggressive litigation that had earned her the nickname the Hammer in legal circles. She pulled up a file on her tablet and showed Marcus a document that made his jaw tighten. "Agent Derek Brennan has 47 documented stops in the past 3 months," Rodriguez said, highlighting sections of text. 43 of those stops involved Black or Latino individuals. 38 were in areas with higher minority populations. Only 4 resulted in any kind of immigration violation, and 3 of those were later dismissed. He has 6 formal complaints filed against him with ICE's Office of Professional Responsibility, none of which resulted in discipline. Detective Kim opened her laptop and turned it toward Marcus. "I pulled Brennan's employment history through our federal law enforcement database access," she said. "He washed out of the DEA in 2015 after 2 excessive force incidents. One involved a traffic stop where he broke a suspect's arm during an arrest for a broken taillight. The suspect was a 19-year-old college student who filed a complaint, but dropped it after the DEA offered a quiet settlement. Brennan was transferred to ICE rather than terminated, and his file shows multiple supervisor notes about overly aggressive enforcement tactics and concerning pattern of minority targeting." Marcus felt his anger crystallizing into something focused and purposeful. "So they knew," he said quietly. "His supervisors knew he was profiling people, and they let him keep working." "They didn't just let him keep working," Assistant Chief Williams said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen this pattern too many times. "According to the information we've gathered, Brennan received a performance commendation 2 months ago for dedication to immigration enforcement. His supervisor praised his proactive approach and commitment to identifying potential violations. They rewarded him for the exact behavior that led to your illegal detention." The ACLU representative, a woman named Janet Foster, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward with an intensity that commanded attention. "Lieutenant Hayes, your case has the potential to expose systemic problems within ICE's enforcement protocols," she said carefully. You're not just a victim here. You're proof that these tactics don't discriminate based on credentials or status. If a decorated police lieutenant can be profiled, detained, and humiliated, then the average citizen has no protection at all. Attorney Chen pulled out a legal pad and started outlining the strategy. "Here's what we're going to do," he said, writing as he spoke. "Tonight, we file formal complaints with every relevant oversight body: Homeland Security Investigations, ICE Office of Professional Responsibility, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and the Office of Inspector General. Tomorrow, we file a federal civil rights lawsuit under Section 1983 against Brennan personally, against Agent Rodriguez as a party to the violation, against their immediate supervisor for failure to properly train and supervise, and against the Department of Homeland Security for maintaining policies that enable racial profiling." Rodriguez added her own notes to a separate pad. "We're also going to file a Freedom of Information Act request for all of Brennan's stop records, his training files, his performance reviews, and any communications between him and his supervisors regarding enforcement tactics," she said. "We want discovery on whether this is just one rogue agent or evidence of departmental policy." Marcus listened to them build the case and felt the situation transforming from a personal violation into something larger and more significant. This wasn't just about getting an apology or even winning money. This was about creating a record that would protect other people from experiencing what he had gone through. Captain Morrison cleared his throat. "Marcus, I want you to know that Charlotte Mecklenburg stands behind you completely," he said formally. "We're treating this as an assault on one of our officers and an attack on the integrity of law enforcement. Chief has already scheduled a press conference for tomorrow morning, where he'll publicly support your case and call for a full federal investigation into ICE's practices in our jurisdiction." Detective Kim pulled up more video footage, this time from Target's parking lot security cameras that Morrison had obtained through an emergency request. The footage showed the entire incident from multiple angles, and watching it on screen made Marcus's stomach turn. He saw himself standing calmly by his car, saw Brennan approach with aggressive body language, saw the moment the handcuffs went on, and his body language shifted from cooperative to rigidly controlled. The timestamps on the video showed he had been detained for 34 minutes total, from the moment Brennan first stopped him until the moment the handcuffs came off. 34 minutes, Marcus said quietly, staring at the screen. "I was handcuffed in a parking lot for over half an hour after they verified my identity. And every second of it is documented," Rodriguez said with satisfaction. "Video evidence, witness statements, radio logs, dispatch recordings. This is the kind of case that civil rights attorneys dream about because the documentation is ironclad." Attorney Chen closed his legal pad and looked directly at Marcus. "Lieutenant Hayes, I'm going to be straight with you about what happens next," he said seriously. "This case is going to take over your life for a while. The media is going to want interviews. ICE is going to try to discredit you or claim you were uncooperative. There will be depositions and court appearances and moments where you'll relive this experience over and over. Federal cases move slowly, and the government has unlimited resources to drag this out. Are you prepared for that?" Marcus thought about his daughter's birthday party, about teaching constitutional law to academy recruits who needed to understand that the badge didn't make them immune to the same prejudices that infected society. He thought about the young black woman in the Target parking lot who had shouted, "That's bullshit," when Brennan lied about probable cause. He thought about every person who would be stopped and detained and violated after him if someone didn't stand up and fight back. "I've spent 15 years building cases against people who abuse their authority," Marcus said firmly. "I've never lost in court, and I'm not starting now. Let's make sure Derek Brennan and everyone who enabled him understands that there are consequences for violating people's rights. The room erupted into focused activity as the legal team began drafting complaints and preparing documentation. Morrison pulled Marcus aside and handed him a business card for the department's psychological services. "You don't have to use this right now," Morrison said quietly. "But what happened to you today was traumatic. Badge or no badge. When you're ready to talk to someone, they're available." Marcus took the card and nodded, appreciating the gesture even as he felt the adrenaline still pumping through his system, keeping the emotional impact at bay. That would come later, he knew, probably in the middle of the night when he couldn't sleep, and kept replaying the moment Brennan grabbed his arm. But right now, he had work to do. His phone buzzed with a text from Angela. "The lawyer from FOP called me. I told him to destroy them. Love you. Come home when you can." Marcus smiled for the first time since the Target parking lot. He had 30 witnesses, multiple video recordings, an airtight legal team, and a wife who was ready to burn down the federal government to protect him. Agent Derek Brennan had made the mistake of his life when he decided that Lieutenant Marcus Hayes looked suspicious enough to detain. And now everyone was going to find out exactly how expensive that mistake would be. The federal lawsuit, Marcus Hayes v. Derek Brennan, Carlos Rodriguez, and the United States Department of Homeland Security, was filed in the United States District Court for the Western District of North Carolina, exactly 72 hours after the Target parking lot incident. And the speed of the filing sent shockwaves through both local law enforcement and federal immigration enforcement circles. Attorney Michael Chen had assembled a complaint that read like a prosecutor's closing argument, laying out each violation in devastating detail, with supporting evidence that included 14 witness statements, 8 separate video recordings, dispatch audio logs, and Target security footage that showed the entire 34-minute detention from 4 different angles. The complaint demanded compensatory damages for civil rights violations, punitive damages for willful misconduct, and injunctive relief requiring ICE to overhaul its training and supervision protocols to prevent future incidents of racial profiling. The case immediately attracted national media attention because it had every element that civil rights advocates had been documenting for years, but rarely with such clear evidence. A decorated police lieutenant with an impeccable record, detained and handcuffed while loading birthday supplies into his car, by a federal agent with a documented history of targeting minorities that his supervisors had not only ignored but rewarded. The optics were devastating for ICE, and within a week of the lawsuit being filed, 3 separate congressional representatives had requested briefings on the agency's enforcement practices in North Carolina. Derek Brennan was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of multiple investigations, and his personnel file became public record through the discovery process in ways that destroyed any credibility he might have claimed. The file revealed that Brennan had been the subject of 11 formal complaints in his 4 years with ICE, ranging from excessive force to discriminatory enforcement to falsifying reports about probable cause for stops. His supervisors had documented concerns about his aggressive tactics and troubling pattern of minority contacts in at least 6 performance reviews, but he had never faced meaningful discipline because his arrest numbers were high and his supervisor valued productivity over constitutional compliance. One memo from Brennan's direct supervisor actually praised his willingness to make tough calls in minority neighborhoods where illegal immigration is suspected, language that the plaintiff's attorneys characterized as explicit approval of racial profiling. Agent Carlos Rodriguez cooperated fully with investigators and provided testimony that proved devastating to both Brennan and their supervisor. Rodriguez admitted in a sworn deposition that Brennan had specifically told him they were going to find some illegals that afternoon and had driven through the Target parking lot looking for anyone who looked foreign. Rodriguez testified that he had felt uncomfortable with the stop from the beginning but had deferred to Brennan's seniority and aggressive confidence. His testimony about Brennan laughing when Marcus identified himself as a police lieutenant, about Brennan saying, "Everyone claims to be a cop when they get caught," became central evidence of willful disregard for constitutional rights. Rodriguez accepted a settlement that required his resignation from ICE, his cooperation with all investigations, and a public apology to Marcus that was read in court and distributed to media outlets. The Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General conducted a comprehensive investigation into ICE's Charlotte field office and found systemic failures in supervision, training, and accountability. The report, which became public 6 months into the litigation, revealed that Brennan's supervisor had been aware of his pattern of minority stops, but had never provided corrective training or implemented oversight measures. The supervisor had instead encouraged proactive enforcement in neighborhoods with high minority populations, creating an environment where agents understood that aggressive tactics would be rewarded rather than punished. 3 supervisors were reassigned or demoted as a result of the investigation, and ICE was forced to implement new protocols requiring reasonable suspicion based on specific articulable facts, rather than generalized assumptions about immigration status based on appearance. The trial began 14 months after the incident, and the courthouse in Charlotte was packed with spectators, media representatives, and civil rights advocates who understood they were watching a landmark case. Marcus took the stand on the second day and testified for 6 hours, describing in careful detail the moment he realized he was being detained, not because of anything he had done, but because of how he looked. His testimony was measured and professional, but when Attorney Chen asked him how it felt to be handcuffed in front of dozens of strangers while his colleagues verified his identity, Marcus's voice broke slightly as he described the humiliation and rage and helplessness of being treated like a criminal despite 15 years of service to his community. "I teach constitutional law at the police academy," Marcus testified, looking directly at the jury. "I spend hours training new officers about probable cause, reasonable suspicion, and the importance of treating every person with dignity regardless of their appearance. And in that parking lot, I learned that none of that mattered to Agent Brennan because he saw my skin color before he saw anything else. If this can happen to me, a lieutenant with a badge and resources and colleagues willing to fight for me, what happens to people who don't have those protections?" The defense attorneys tried to argue that Brennan had been conducting a legitimate immigration compliance check, and that Marcus had been uncooperative and suspicious in his behavior. But the video evidence destroyed that narrative completely. The jury watched footage of Marcus standing calmly with his hands visible, heard him clearly identify himself as a police officer, saw him comply with every command while stating his constitutional objections for the record. They watched Brennan laugh when Marcus showed his credentials, heard Brennan order him handcuffed despite confirmation of his identity, and saw the red marks on Marcus's wrists when the restraints were finally removed. The defense's case collapsed under the weight of documented evidence that showed Brennan had no legitimate basis for the stop and had continued the detention even after learning Marcus's true identity. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict that sent shockwaves through federal law enforcement. They found Derek Brennan liable for false imprisonment, unlawful detention, assault, battery, and deprivation of civil rights under color of federal authority, and awarded Marcus $8.2 million in compensatory damages for emotional distress, humiliation, and violation of his constitutional rights. The punitive damages were even more stunning, with the jury awarding an additional $5.7 million against Brennan personally and the Department of Homeland Security jointly, specifically to punish the willful nature of the violations and deter future misconduct. The total judgment of $13.9 million was one of the largest civil rights verdicts against federal agents in North Carolina history. Derek Brennan's career ended the day the verdict was read, but the consequences extended far beyond his termination. The Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation into whether Brennan had violated federal civil rights statutes, and, while he was never criminally charged, his law enforcement credentials were permanently revoked, and he became unemployable in any security or government position. His personnel file and the trial testimony became part of public record, ensuring that anyone who searched his name would find detailed documentation of his pattern of racial profiling and constitutional violations. Agent Rodriguez's resignation and cooperation spared him from the harshest consequences. But his law enforcement career was over at age 29, and he returned to Texas to work in his family's construction business. His dreams of federal service destroyed by his decision to follow Brennan's lead instead of his own conscience. The systemic changes that resulted from the case went beyond individual accountability and forced ICE to fundamentally restructure its enforcement protocols in ways that civil rights advocates had been demanding for years. The agency implemented mandatory training on constitutional standards for stops and detentions, created an independent oversight committee to review complaints of discriminatory enforcement, and established clear disciplinary consequences for agents who engaged in racial profiling. Supervisors were required to review body camera footage and stop reports to identify patterns of potentially discriminatory enforcement, and agents who showed such patterns faced mandatory retraining or termination. The Charlotte field office became a pilot program for these reforms, with quarterly audits and community oversight that transformed the relationship between ICE and the local population. Marcus used a significant portion of his settlement to establish the Marcus Hayes Civil Rights Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provided legal assistance to people who experienced civil rights violations but lacked the resources to fight back. The foundation partnered with law schools and civil rights organizations to offer free legal representation in cases involving police misconduct, discrimination, and constitutional violations. Within 3 years, the foundation had handled over 200 cases and secured settlements totaling more than $4 million for victims who otherwise would have had no recourse against powerful institutions. Marcus became a sought-after speaker at law enforcement conferences and civil rights symposiums, sharing his story not as a victim, but as someone who had transformed personal trauma into systemic change. The impact on Marcus's personal life was complex and lasted far longer than the legal proceedings. He returned to work at Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department after a month of leave, but something had shifted in how he viewed his role and his relationship with the badge he had worn with pride for 15 years. He understood now in a visceral way what it meant to be seen as suspicious simply for existing in public while black, and that knowledge changed how he trained recruits and how he evaluated officers under his command. He became fierce about accountability and constitutional compliance, earning a reputation as someone who would support his officers completely, but only if they operated within the bounds of law and human decency. 3 officers who complained that Marcus was too focused on civil rights were transferred to other districts, and Morrison backed him completely because the department understood that Marcus Hayes had earned the right to demand excellence from everyone around him. His daughter's 10th birthday party happened 2 days after the Target parking lot incident, and Marcus showed up with the decorations and chips he had bought, wearing long sleeves to hide the bruises on his wrists and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Angela had wanted to cancel the party, to give him time to process what had happened, but Marcus insisted because he refused to let Derek Brennan take one more thing from his family. The party was loud and joyful and full of children who had no idea that their friend's father had been handcuffed in public 48 hours earlier. And Marcus grilled hot dogs and cut cake and pretended everything was fine. But that night, after the guests left, and his daughter was asleep, he sat in his darkened living room with Angela and finally let himself feel the full weight of the humiliation and rage and fear he had been holding back. She held him while he cried, and they talked until dawn about what it meant to raise a black child in a country where even a badge couldn't protect you from being profiled. The psychological impact lingered in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated. He found himself hyper-aware of his appearance when he went out in public, choosing what he wore with an eye toward looking safe and professional, even on his days off. He noticed every security guard who followed him in stores, every stranger who clutched their purse when he walked past, every interaction where he felt he had to prove his legitimacy and humanity. The therapist Morrison had recommended helped him understand that what he experienced was a form of trauma that many black men carried but rarely acknowledged. The constant low-level stress of navigating a world that viewed you with suspicion before you even opened your mouth. Marcus worked through it with the same determination he brought to everything else in his life, and he emerged stronger but fundamentally changed, no longer able to pretend that the system he served was blind to color or fair in its application of power. The case became required reading in law schools and police academies across the country, a clear example of how racial profiling violates constitutional rights and destroys public trust in law enforcement. Marcus's testimony was excerpted in civil rights textbooks, and the video footage from the Target parking lot was shown in training sessions as an example of what not to do during police contacts. Future agents and officers watched Derek Brennan's aggressive approach and heard Marcus's calm assertion of his rights, and instructors used the case to illustrate the difference between legitimate law enforcement and discriminatory harassment dressed up as official duty. 5 years after the verdict, Marcus was promoted to captain and given command of the East District, becoming one of the youngest captains in Charlotte-Mecklenburg history. He accepted the promotion with pride, but also with a commitment to use his platform to ensure that what happened to him never happened to anyone else under his watch. His first act as captain was to implement a mandatory training program on implicit bias and constitutional policing, and he invited community leaders and civil rights advocates to participate in designing the curriculum. Officers who served under Captain Hayes knew that he demanded excellence and integrity above all else, and that he would support them through difficult situations, but never tolerate abuse of power or discriminatory enforcement. Derek Brennan faded into obscurity after the trial, his name permanently associated with one of the most egregious examples of racial profiling in recent federal law enforcement history. He declared bankruptcy to avoid paying the full punitive damages judgment, but the compensatory damages were paid by the Department of Homeland Security, and Marcus received every dollar the jury awarded. Brennan's life became a cautionary tale about the consequences of letting prejudice guide professional judgment, and his case was cited in dozens of subsequent civil rights lawsuits as evidence of systemic problems within federal immigration enforcement. The $13.9 million verdict sent a clear message to federal agents across the country that constitutional rights applied to everyone regardless of appearance, and that violating those rights would result in career-ending consequences and financial devastation. Civil rights attorneys used the Hayes case as a template for similar lawsuits, and in the 5 years following the verdict, ICE faced more than 40 civil rights lawsuits alleging racial profiling and unlawful detention. Several resulted in significant settlements and forced the agency to continue reforming its practices and holding agents accountable for discriminatory enforcement. Marcus never forgot the faces of the witnesses in the Target parking lot who had stood with their phones out recording his humiliation, and he made a point of thanking several of them personally after the trial. The young black woman who had shouted at Brennan attended the verdict announcement and hugged Marcus with tears streaming down her face, telling him that watching him fight back had inspired her to go to law school to become a civil rights attorney. The elderly white woman who had defended him sent a letter to the editor of the Charlotte Observer praising Marcus's dignity and calling for more accountability in law enforcement. Those small moments of connection reminded Marcus that his case had resonated beyond the courtroom and had given people hope that justice was possible even when the odds seemed overwhelming. On the 5-year anniversary of the incident, Marcus returned to the Target parking lot where it had all happened, not out of morbid curiosity, but because he wanted to reclaim that space and strip it of the power it held over him. He parked in almost the exact same spot where his wife's Honda had been that day, and he stood in the afternoon sun loading groceries into his trunk, just like he had been doing when Derek Brennan decided he looked suspicious. But this time there were no handcuffs, no aggressive federal agents, no humiliation. Just a police captain loading groceries on his day off, exactly as free as the Constitution promised he had every right to be. The fight had been long and exhausting and had cost him sleep and peace of mind, and the naive belief that his badge would protect him from the prejudices that infected American society. But Marcus Hayes had won more than $13.9 million. He had won accountability. He had won systemic change. He had won a measure of justice not just for himself, but for everyone who came after him. And in the end, that was worth every difficult moment of the battle, because Lieutenant Marcus Hayes had kept the promise he made to himself in that parking lot 5 years earlier. He had made sure Derek Brennan never forgot the day he decided a black man loading birthday supplies was suspicious enough to detain, and he had made certain that the cost of that decision would echo through federal law enforcement for generations to come.
Truth is a continuous pursuit, and awareness is your best defense. Thank you for watching and championing global transparency.